Morning, YouTube. It's been a while since we've been on here, but we've been filming reconstructing Spirit Hill. Well, we'll get back to building that later. So, winter has finally arrived here in North Carolina, and we have a major problem here. All of our hoses have turned to ice. Now, we can fix this in several ways. We have about 500 feet of hoses throughout this property feeding horses and dogs and goats. You could easily stack some bales of hay along your hose line and help keep it insulated from the frost. This particular hose line goes to our RV, so we want to do a little extra care to make sure that this stays defrosted, because there's nothing that says cabin fever more than not having water to brush your teeth or use the restroom. So let's get started on this. I'll show you what we need, and should be a pretty easy process, but we'll find out. Okay, so what I have here is I've got some 1-inch pipe insulators. See, we've got some duct tape, very useful tool. Some zip ties. Got a little bit of pipe insulation wrap, and then I've got these guys here. Some people call this heat tape, but this is called EasyHeat. It's going to plug in and actually heat our hose line for us. These come in 30-foot sections, so I got 60 feet. That'll cover most of my hose line, hopefully, and should be able to plug it in, and it should be able to defrost our hose line for us. So let's start putting this together and see what we come up with. I'm going to start off with installing the heat strip tape, since that's going to have to go below everything else. Start your installation with the end of the heat strip closest to the RV or the end of your line, and use zip ties to tie it on to the hose, and just kind of work your way down the line as you go. It's good to have heat strips easily available to you so you can work both hands. As you're working the heat strip along the line, use your insulation tubes and wrap it together with the hose and the heat strip, and then you can use duct tape, or you can use your zip ties. I found as I went that the zip ties were a lot easier than the duct tape, but duct tape's also a little cheaper, so whichever one works best. But kind of work your tube on the insulation while you're installing everything all at once. So your tube is holding the heat strip together, and then you zip tie it or duct tape it, whatever way seems fit. Probably the most important thing here is just to make sure that you're covering every inch of that hose line, and you want to make sure that that heat strip is tightly against the hose and well inside that insulation tube. One side of the insulation tube is going to be open for fitting it around, so try and get that heat strip kind of on the back side of that tube. If you're working with a hose that's frozen, it's going to be all curled up and formed in weird formations, and that's where the duct tape can really become useful. Once you get out to a spot where it's just a straight run, it's going to be a lot easier, and you can resort back to the just the zip ties. And when you get down to the plugs, the directions would say to put one plug at one end and then run it out, and have the two non-plug ends meet. I actually put the two plugs together so I can plug them into a single source. And on these plugs on these heat strips, you'll find that there's a sensor. You can see it there by my hands, and you want to make sure you get a zip tie on each side of that sensor to hold it firmly against
the hose or the pipe that you're trying to heat. That sensor tells the heat strip when to turn on and off. Once you have done this in this area, this is where you can use your insulated tape to wrap it up, because you're not really going to be able to use the insulation tubes and correctly cover everything. Make sure you go over it multiple times and that you've covered all the areas. You don't want to leave anything open to the elements. After you do that, you can continue on just like you did before, installing your insulation tube over the heat strip and the hose, and zip tying it together and just slowly making your way all the way down to the end. Be sure to insulate your lines around the pump. Those can freeze as well, so you'd be wasting your time if you didn't. Make sure that every square inch of your pipe is insulated and well wrapped, that there's no holes, and that you do that all the way back to the end, and if you're doing this to an RV, all the way to the spigot of the RV.
As you can see, I have successfully defrosted my water, at least near the well pump. Problem that I now have is that the meter froze and actually cracked, so water is coming out. So YouTube, you are in a treat. I am going to do a replacement on that, so we'll get a whole nother well repair video here in a few minutes. But I've wrapped up all the lines around the well pump because those were freezing as well. Those defrosted the fastest because they're inside a building and they weren't frozen as bad. But I didn't have to put any heat strips in here, just the insulation to get that defrosted. I do have a heater on the floor here just pumping in some heat to help the process along a little bit. But so now I basically have an electric heater sitting in a room with dripping water that's forming puddles. Not an ideal situation.